When it comes to improving our running performance in training, there are a lot of things that we should know as runners, but often don't until we learn the hard way. So today's goal is to share with you guys 7 things that us runners should know to help us improve our running performance and help us get faster. And we're going to dive straight in to point number 1. Now, point number 1 is very, very obvious, but we've got to get it out of the way because points number 2 to 7 spin off the back of that, a lot more in depth, and they kind of all tie together. So it's really important for me to start off by saying that consistency is absolutely key here. With running, when we're doing training, racing, everything, the bigger picture is if we can stack training block on top of training block on top of training block and keep as injury free as possible and keep stacking up that training load, that's what's going to get us the fittest. It beats absolutely everything. So when we are training, we don't want to go through a training block and have 2 or 3 amazing workouts, think we're in really, really good shape and then get injured because we've pushed too hard. It's all about getting through each training block, ticking off the races and then moving on to the next one. And that's going to lead me nicely into point number 2. And so point number 2 is all about control, controlling our training sessions in particular. This is something that I've got better at over the last 2 or 3 years. Not perfect, but a heck of a lot better. But in the past, I've been very, very guilty of really thrashing myself in training. So why do we want to control things a little bit more? Well, if we're told to go out and do a certain number of repetitions at a certain effort, then that's really what we want to do. We don't want to be trying to push it a little bit too much. I'm of the mentality that if you're having a good day, go with it. And if you're feeling good and the paces are good, then absolutely enjoy it, because not all days feel like that. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to the well. That doesn't mean I'm rinsing myself, and that doesn't mean that I'm on my knees at the end of a training session. Because what we have to think about here is recovery and going into the next run. If we have another run that evening or the next day or in 2 days' time, we need to be ready for that next run. And if we absolutely empty the tank during that session, it's going to be a heck of a lot harder for our bodies to recover, pick ourselves up and go again for that next run. And all that fatigue building up, if you continue to do that, it's just going to build up to the point where you're going to get injured. Now, when I say control, what I'm thinking usually when I'm doing stuff is kind of doing a repetition set and going, right, could I have done 1 more or 2 more? Yes, brilliant. That's the effort that I wanted. So I've nearly gone all the way, but I've just held back a tiny bit, knowing that I had a tiny bit more in the tank to maybe have been able to complete another rep or 2 afterwards. That's a good benchmark for me to know if I've controlled this session well. And point number 3, something we should all keep in the back of our heads, is appreciate that potentially, just sometimes, we might not see the fruits of our labour straight away. And this can come in a variety of forms. So what I mean by this is if we're doing a 12, 14, 16, 20 week training block, naturally throughout the training block, we're going to get fitter. And we're going to start at point A, finish at point B, and overall, hopefully, our fitness is going to trend upwards. So we know, deep down, we as runners know that we get fitter throughout that training block if training structured correctly and we're doing everything right as best as possible. But there are some occasions when we head out to races and we don't execute the race that we want to. We kick ourselves because we go, I didn't get a chance to showcase the fitness level that I'm at. I didn't get to execute the race plan that I wanted. And that can be for a variety of reasons, whether we potentially overtrained a little bit, whether it's weather, whatever, and it's a little bit warmer than what we've been used to training in, whatever it might be, there's a multitude of reasons why that race might not go to plan. And so what I like to do and tell myself as a little tip for you guys is that when I am training, I'm always thinking ahead to the next training block and the next training block and going, I'm doing my best right now. I know what my goal is at the end of this training block. I'm going to work as hard as I can to get to that goal. But just imagine, just think how fit you're going to be when you go into your next training block. That's the positive mantra that I always tell myself. Just think about how fit you're going to be when you start your next training block. Because each training block, what we're trying to do really is climb a rung on a ladder. So we're just trying to take that next step and start on that next step up. Or if we start back to where we were because we had a bit of a break, get to that next step a lot faster than what we would have done in our previous training block. So naturally, if we can stack all of this up and keep moving forward, then potentially we're going to see the fruits of our labour in future training blocks if our races don't go to plan. Controversial, yes, I appreciate that, but We all know we get fitter during a training block. Sometimes we just don't have the race that we had planned. And number 4 is a good one because I think a lot of us runners bury our heads in the sand a little bit here. It's something that I finally really started to focus on over the last 18 months or so, and that is understanding our weaknesses in running and our mobility, our form, everything like that. Understanding what those weaknesses are. Now, I'm very fortunate because I document my journey on YouTube. I get a lot of footage of myself. I film myself. And I can obviously feel as I'm running like where my imbalances are in my body. I know it's on my right side. I know my right foot kicks out. I know my right glute is weak. I know where all of my weaknesses are. And I think understanding that as a runner is really, really important to implementing something moving forwards to allow us to break the habit of that potential injury chain that we keep coming across, like we build up and up and up, and that weakness then gets exposed again. This used to happen to me all the time. I really had a weak spot on my right side, and as I said, over the last 18 months in particular, I've really started to address that, which we'll talk about shortly, but that's more a case of just first of all understanding and accepting. That's the hardest thing for us runners, accepting that we might have a weakness in our posture, running form, mobility in particular. I want to give you a very quick example. Something that I really noticed, my hips were so tight from sitting in a chair all day. When I was trying to squat, I could barely get past 90 degrees. So what I've been working on trying to do is doing deep squats, holding on to something so that I can almost now deep squat right to the floor. And that's taken a long time to get to that point, but just going, you have a real big weakness there in your hips. How can we start to address that? Let's implement something that's going to really help you moving forward. And I think that's a really key thing for you guys to think about as well. And the 5th thing we should all do, following straight off the back of that, is now starting to implement 1 or 2 things a week that are very doable, very manageable, that are going to help us build up resistance to those weaknesses and build up strength. Now, what tends to happen with runners is we go, I need to strength train, I need to do X, Y, and Z, I need to jump into it at the deep end. And often these things don't stick. They don't become habit because we love to run, and everything else is just a chore for a lot of us. Not all of us, but for a lot of us. Thankfully, what I managed to do 18 months ago was really home in on those weaknesses, fed up of a string of poor race results, the body breaking down, and then starting to address it. So one of those things, as I just said, is starting to do daily a deep squat, or holding onto something like a pole or the corner of a sofa, and deep squatting, supporting your body, but for me, lowering that down, getting those hips opened up, and now making big progress to the point where I am nearly flat-footed in a deep squat position. That's taken 6+ months, but it's been worth every second because I feel such a massive difference in my running form. And plus, combined with that, I'm also doing upper body weights because I know my back's an issue. I'm doing core work and glute work, but I've managed to make that now habit. And that's all started from simply doing deep squat work and then kettlebell work. I took a kettlebell and I did some hip and glute work, got myself into that habit, then came the upper back, then came the core, and now it's all a package. But that would never have happened altogether if I hadn't have just started implementing 1 or 2 things to make it seem manageable. Because what happens is when you do 1 or 2 things and you see the massive difference that it makes, that makes you more inclined then to address more things because you realize how much better it's making you as a runner. Make sense? So basically, all you have to do is start to think about your weaknesses, and then what can I do to implement into my weekly routine that's not going to take up a drastic amount of time, but it's going to start to address some of these weaknesses and help me moving forward. And the point number 6 is a little bit of a different one, but I feel it's really beneficial for a lot of runners mentally just as much as physically. And that is having points in training where you're focused heavily on racing. So you might have a summer season of track racing, 5K racing, and then you want another period of training where you're just focusing head down, grinding on training. I don't really like to use the word grinding. I use it because for me, it's a good motivation. For a lot of people, it can be a bit of a negative connotation, but I think deep down what we need to think about is being in a position where we're in a race season, and then also being in a position where we're just getting our head down and training hard. Great example for me in particular, I took a summer of doing 4 or 5 races in a 9-week period, which isn't a massive amount, but I had a good focus there when I was doing a 10K training block on racing. This next 12-week training block, I'm only racing once in between now and my goal race, and that's it, because I just want to get my head down. And the reason for that is because at the end of the 9 weeks, I knew where my fitness level was at. I knew that I wasn't going to get drastically better by continuing to race. I knew that I had to get my head down and grind and work hard in the next training block and not have too many gaps and stops for racing and mini tapers and stuff like that. I had to just literally get my head down and train, and right now I'm loving it. And there's two different mentalities that go with that, and I think if a lot of us runners start running because we want to train for a marathon, it's something that we're passionate about, and we go, do you know what, I want to raise money for this charity because this has happened in my life and it's super inspired me to get out the door and train for the London Marathon, or whatever it might be, that's great. And then moving on past that, we start to get drawn into more and more big races. That's brilliant, it's great to race, but also I think as you become a more experienced runner, it's really important to just take a step back from all of that and start to appreciate the process of training, start to appreciate the joys that running brings us, and not necessarily having this end goal of a medal and a t-shirt and whatever else, but going, do you know what, I just appreciate being healthy, being able to get out the door, being able to run at this pace for this distance. I could never have done that years ago. This is where my running journey's taken me. So I think there's two different mentalities there. One, racing when we're enjoying ourselves, getting ready to race, getting that adrenaline going, feeling fired up. And the other side is getting our heads down, working hard, because we know then in the following training block, when we might want to pick things back racing wise, we're going to be so much further ahead than we were. And the final thing that I think runners should know, and this is going to divide opinion, and there is no right or wrong, I am just going to say this right now, is I feel like super shoes or carbon plated shoes that aid us, certainly can warp our vision of our own fitness. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I was to go out and do a moderate run in a shoe with a carbon plate and then one without, I'm going to find that potentially my heart rate for the same pace is maybe 3, 4, 5 beats a minute higher in the non-plated shoe than is the plated. Now there's pros and cons to both, and I'm not going to go in and dive into a whole world and open up a whole can of worms on training in super shoes or not. I've done plenty of videos on that in the past, injury risks, all of that stuff. There's pros and cons to everything, but I think what we all have to as runners be aware of and be very grounded at is that I've gone into training blocks where I have training plated shoes, and I've gone in because I've hit certain paces in training due to the plates. I've gone in with a slightly higher expectation of what I'm going to get out of the race, and I'm going to be honest with you, to date right now, I don't think I've ever hit those higher expectations when I have trained in super shoes and maybe hit certain pace in reps and go, well, maybe I can hold that for X amount of time, for a 10K, for a 5K. It's just never happened. So I often find that I prefer to just use a carbon plated shoe maybe once a week at best, unless I'm testing shoes, and then I tend to use non-plated shoes for the rest of the time, because I like to go into race day and have something super light on feet that I can absolutely fly on. Now the plus side of super shoes and all these amazing foams and stuff is recovery. So if we are doing higher mileage, they do help us recover naturally, but when we use carbon plates, our biomechanics change. And so there's that to take into consideration as well. Different muscle groups shut down, others kick in, and the way our body runs with carbon plates. Like for me, for example, I know like my calves will burn a lot if I use a lot of plated shoes, and other people will suffer with hip issues and stuff like that. It's just the way it is. It's a balance, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I think what all of us runners need to understand is that if we do train in carbon plated shoes, it's really important to just keep ourselves grounded and go, yep, that's brilliant, we hit these certain paces during training, fantastic, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm then going to go and do that in a race. That just means that I'm pretty darn good in these shoes, I'm most efficient, and these are the shoes that I'm going to race in. So there we go, those are my 7 things that I think runners should really know, often might bury our heads in the sand, but should know to help us improve our running and get faster. Hopefully you'll understand now why I had to mention consistency at the start, because everything following that adds up to being consistent. We're talking about controlling those sessions, we're talking about understanding that fitness right now, if we don't have that perfect race, it might come into fruition later down the line. We're talking about things like understanding that we have periods of time when we want to maybe race a little bit harder, but also getting that mentality right for training rather than racing. Super shoes, you know, that's going to be a bit of a dividing opinion. That's just my opinion. Obviously we're all entitled, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one in particular down below. I'm not for or against it, I've talked about it enough before, but I just feel like sometimes it can kind of skew our vision on where our fitness is at, and I think that can be a bit of a dangerous thing, because that gets our expectations up, and then when we don't quite hit it in a feel free. It'd be brilliant to hear your thoughts and obviously let everyone else read it as well. That's it from me.